religious parents. They tried to become Americanized and saw Americanization as being antithetical to Old World Judaism. But my maternal grandmother was deeply and profoundly religious. And she was my first Rebbe, my first teacher. I lived in Bedford-Stuyvesant, Brooklyn. Anybody here know about Bedford-Stuyvesant, Brooklyn? Now it's gentrifying. But when I grew up in Bedford-Stuyvesant, Brooklyn, it wasn't gentrified at all. It looked like a burnt-out war zone. And there were constant gang fights between the African Americans and the Italians. Now, I lived a charmed life. I was short and round and bookish. And there was a library, Tompkins Library, a few blocks away. And I took out 4 books every week, which I read. And my goal was to finish all the books of the library. I didn't quite do that. But the African Americans put together somehow the books and the Jew beanie, which they called the kippah that I wore. Because of the street fights, the public schools were filled with knives instead of books, so I was sent to a day school. And my grandmother saw her chance, because she was very, very devout. And she promised my mother that if my mother would keep kosher, she would supply the meat and the chicken. Because my mother kept kosher. When my grandfather died when I was 10, and my grandmother was disconsolate, the suggestion was that I spend every Friday evening with my grandmother. She lived 2 blocks away. And I'll never forget how she would stand before the candles on Friday evening for at least 20 minutes, speaking to God in Yiddish about every single one of her children and grandchildren. In some cases giving thanksgiving, in other cases beseeching. I once thought of writing a book about her called God Was My Psychiatrist. But I learned how to talk to God. We don't usually do that. And in certain places in the prayer where this is encouraged, like Elokai Netzor at the end of the Amidah, I do talk to God. And it's always in Yiddish, because that's how I spoke to my grandmother. And that's how she spoke to God. And that's where I learned to pray. It was more than that, you see, because my grandmother, her father, my great-grandfather, whom I'm named after, was a dayan, a judge in the small town of Lublin. I visited that town. In 1994, I was invited to speak at the main synagogue in Warsaw, in Yiddish actually, the 50th anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And I met a physics student who spoke English and Polish fluently and was studying conversion to become Jewish. And he asked if I could spend some time with him. And I said, listen, I'll give you $200. Take me to the little shtetl of Lublin. He said, I'll do it for $100. And he did it early Sunday morning with me that weekend. We went back to Lublin, and I saw the little shtetl, and I met the daughter of the mayor at that time, who was the mayor at that time. Learned a lot about the family, and a lot of the family kind of legends seemed to be true. At any rate, my great-grandfather was the rabbina of the rabbina, so he was the judge. There was a rabbi and a judge. There were 300 houses in Lublin when I visited in 1994. all Polish Christian houses. This woman explained to me that when my grandparents were there were also 300 houses, but 150 Jewish and 150 Polish. Anyway, my great-grandfather had 4 daughters before he had sons. And he desperately wanted to give over his Torah. And my grandmother desperately, as a young girl, wanted to learn. So she studied first Bible with commentaries, and then she asked to study Mishnah, and he taught her Mishnah, and then she asked to study Gemara, and he taught her Gemara. And when she left Lublin with my grandfather in 1922, she begged him to take a picture so she would remember him, because she knew it was the last time she would ever see him. And he was a Ger Chassid. He wouldn't take a picture. He felt it was a graven image. But he said, I will give you a shas, a set of Talmud tomes. Because we studied Talmud together, and you're going to go to the New World and continue to study Talmud. And as you study Talmud, you'll remember me. So I thought that every old woman from Europe knows how to learn and teach Talmud. And that's the origin of my feminism. But anyway, Friday evening meals were very special. Before my bar mitzvah, my grandmother made kiddush. After my bar mitzvah, I made kiddush for her. Sang Zmirot, ate wonderful food, you can imagine. Studied Yiddishkeit in Yiddish, a portion of the Bible every week, and began to learn the tractate Brachot. From age 10 to age 20. 20, I was graduated from college. The day of my graduation, and I was the valedictorian. My grandmother passed away, but before she passed away, she gave me the Talmud that she had from her father. And I want to tell you just one little story about my grandmother. She prayed 3 times a day. She was very, very devout. And, of course, exceedingly knowledgeable. But one thing stands out in my mind. In the house, it was on Vernon Avenue, 122 Vernon Avenue, Vernon and Tompkins. A house which was for me a second home, in certain ways a first home. My aunt and uncle lived on the 3rd floor. My grandparents lived on the 1st floor. And there was a middle floor with a big room, and that was the room of the Goy. Didn't have a name. He was the Goy. But he was present at all family occasions. The Pesach Seder, the Purim meal, Su'udah, and he sat right next to my grandfather. I could picture him. He had long ears. He was short, thin, with long ears. I thought he was a deaf mute because he didn't speak, but then I realized later on he only spoke Polish. And I never could figure it out. I thought when I was really a little boy that he was Elijah the prophet. What else was he doing there? He must be Elijah the prophet. At any rate, the neighborhood got worse and worse. And we had an uncle who was a fairly successful business person, Uncle Dave. And one Friday, he was visiting my grandmother, and I was in my grandmother's home, as usual, on Friday. And he said to my grandmother he wanted her to move. The neighborhood was bad. They were taking advantage of older women especially, the gangs, etc. And I told you I was never in a fight because I was a mascot. They didn't let me play stickball, get up to bat, because I was not athletic. But I was like a good luck charm for the African Americans, and they protected me against the Italians, and I lived a charmed life. So the neighborhood was fine for me. But my uncle was correctly nervous about his mother's well-being, and my aunt and uncle as well, and he had found an apartment in Bensonhurst, which was the Heichefenster, you know, the Beverly Hills at that time of Brooklyn. And I'm listening to their conversation with a little bit panic because I didn't want to lose my grandmother. And my grandmother said, but I felt it was very good for her and it was important for her and it should happen. And my grandmother said, she's not certain, she has to think about it, she needs at least a week and probably a month. My uncle was perplexed, but he left the house. My grandmother explained to me. She said, "Mein Kind, you know, I would move, and it's important for your aunt and uncle that we move. I'll miss you, but you'll come to me in Bensonhurst for Shabbatot. But what's going to happen to the guy? We met him on the ship from Poland. He's all alone. He has no family. I can't leave him alone." So she said, Sunday, I used to go to yeshiva on Sunday, but I came home early in the afternoon. She said, Sunday afternoon, please meet me. Now this is the winter time. It was cold, it was rainy, it was snowy, it was sleety. My grandmother at that time was in her 80s. She died at age 90. My grandmother and I walked the streets of Bedford-Stuyvesant wherever there was a to let sign. I was a translator because she didn't speak a word of English. She became a tzitzin because she had to vote for Rosenfeld, who she was sure that he was Jewish. He was such a fine man. It turns out that he was pretty anti-Semitic and didn't let even the numerous Klauses that he should have let in during the Second World War of Jews. But she became a citizen somehow. They bribed the judge, I guess, I don't know. But she became a citizen. And she was proud to be an American citizen. But she couldn't speak English. So I was a translator. And I can't describe to you the kind of places we went into. And it had to be clean. And she argued about the amount of money that he had to pay every week. She had to find a room for him that wouldn't be more expensive than what he was paying her. And it took 4 Sundays. But only when she found the room for the guy did she agree to move. That was a very important lesson to me about V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. Now I want to tell you a second story. My mother. My mother was not an observant woman in this part of her life. At the end of her life, she lived in a frat and she became observant. But she was pretty sure of herself. And she was only worried, the one great worry of her life was that I would become Nebuch, an Orthodox rabbi. Because Orthodox rabbis starved merrily at that time. And every time, in every juncture, I was supposed to go to Stuyvesant, and I got a scholarship to Brooklyn TA, Yeshiva University High School of Brooklyn, and my parents agreed, but my mother made me promise I wouldn't become a rabbi. Then, after high school, I was supposed to go to Harvard, I got a scholarship to YU, Yeshiva University. I wanted to continue learning and go to YU. My mother was devastated, but she made me promise that I wouldn't become an Orthodox rabbi. At the end of the day, I became an Orthodox rabbi. Anyway, my mother was not observant and was a little nervous about my observance. And once a week on Shabbos lunch, when I came home from shul, my mother and I would eat lunch together and talk. And I had a religious friend, Saul Berman, whose father was a rabbi in the community, and he was my Shabbos friend. The African Americans were my weekday friends, and he was my Shabbos friend. And I used to go always to his house. I'd have lunch with my mother, I would go to his house, and spend the whole Shabbos afternoon in his house. He's quite a prominent rabbi in New York and teaches at Stern College. Anyway, a knock on the door, Shabbos afternoon. My mother goes to the door, and I saw that for the first time, I saw my mother discombobulated. My mother smoked 3 cigarettes a day after each meal. And Shabbos afternoon, she was smoking a cigarette. Knock on the door. My mother went to the door, and it was for the first time Saul Berman coming to visit me. I was a little late, apparently. Lunch with my mother had taken longer than usual, and he came to call for me. And my mother was discombobulated because she didn't know what to do with the cigarette. She knew he was a rabbi's son. She had great respect for religion because of her parents. And she was stuck. And for the first time, I saw her discombobulated. And she put the cigarette back, and I realized it was a tense moment, so I went over to the door. Maybe I was 10 or 11. I went over to the door, and I told him that I would soon meet him in his house, and he left. My mother came back, and she said, "You know, I think God made a mistake. You should have been born into my parents' household. We're really not such a good mix, you and I." And then she thought for a moment, and she said, "No, God knew exactly what he was doing. Because against my better judgment, you probably will become an Orthodox rabbi. And at least, because of me, you will love people who are not Orthodox as well." I never forgot that conversation. And I decided my mother was indeed very, very wise. And I want to tell you a third vignette. My father was never bar mitzvah. In his later years, he had a special aliyah that we called his bar mitzvah when he was 83. Because his father was a communist ideologue who wrote for the Yiddish communist newspaper in New York. Freiheit, it was called. Freiheit. He had a regular column. He was an intellectual. He was really an ideologue. And he was a very special person. I'll tell you how special he was, because he really was special. He organized the workers in his father's, they were from Belarus, And his father had a factory that prepared uniforms for the Tsar. Very successful and very religious. My grandfather, my paternal grandfather, organized the workers in his father's shop against his father. Communist. And was sent to Siberia. He got out of Siberia. And he got to America, and he had golden hands. And he met my grandmother, and he got married. She was not religious, but she was into acting a little bit. I saw with her all Shakespearean plays in Yiddish. I used to meet her once a week. And I learned Shakespeare. I thought Shakespeare originally was Yiddish. And you know what they used to have? Macbeth by William Shakespeare, verteidigt and verbessert, translated and improved upon by Shlomo Goldberg. I remember that as a kid. And I used to go, it was fascinating and very interesting. Anyway, my grandfather began this business with his hands, making woodwork. And it became successful. And when it became really successful, he gave the business over to the 4 workers. He took an equal share. In other words, there were 5 shares. My grandmother didn't speak to him for 6 months after that. She said, if you first began to make money, in the beginning, you didn't make any money, you paid your workmen. Now you begin to make money, and everybody shared. She was furious. But I respected him a lot. And he really believed at that point in his life, he really believed that communism was tikkun olam, that it would perfect the world. And he was straight and honest. So he was really a very special person. And an atheist. An avowed, self-avowed atheist. He helped me with Yiddish, however. He actually taught me literary Yiddish. Shalom Aleichem, he used to read first to me and then with me. So I really learned Yiddish from him. And at my bar mitzvah, I had a pilpul. I said a drasha in Yiddish. A soch ben tefillah letefillah, a shir of Rabbi Riskin, I still remember. An hour and a half pilpul in Yiddish. And he helped me with the Yiddish. My father and my grandfather would meet at the schwitz. Anybody here know what a schwitz is? A sauna is a desiccated schwitz. It's a pale reflection of the schwitz. But I went, my father and my grandfather would meet at the schwitz Shabbos afternoon, and I would meet them Saturday night after the Sabbath ended. I would meet them. And we would have tremendous ideological arguments. And what was fascinating was my grandfather treated me like an adult, and I was always talking about God and defending God, and they were communists, and they were trying to preach communism, and Menshevikism versus Stalinist communism, and it was a very ideological place with a lot of Yiddish discussion and debate, and I loved it. The Shabbos night before my bar mitzvah, my grandfather told me he couldn't come to my bar mitzvah. And I was devastated. And he had helped me with my pilpul. And I said, why not? And he said, well, he made an oath at his bar mitzvah he would never step into a synagogue again. Now, if I had the brains then that I have now, I would have said to him, who did you make the oath to? What was the issue? But at that time, and I burst out in tears, and my father whispered to me that his father was stubborn, and it wouldn't help, and just forget about it. Anyway, came Shabbat morning, and when I got up, to give the talk, after the Torah reading, my grandfather walked in. He was apparently waiting outside the shul until I would get up to speak. And my grandfather walked in. He had a brown paper bag, and he walked up to the front, sat right in front of me. And after I gave the pilpul, he kissed me on the forehead. It meant a lot to me. And he gave me the brown paper bag in which there were 2 books, the Communist Manifesto and Das Kapital by Karl Marx. I think I was the only bar mitzvah boy in history to have gotten that kind of gift. 2 more memories. My first memory. I was 3 years old. My grandfather came into my house with a little table and a little stool. Gift. Because he had golden hands, and it's still in the family. My sister has, one of my sisters has it in her home today, still. And then my grandfather said to me, "Can you make your fingers like this?" You know what this is? The priestly benediction. When the priests, the Kohanim, and I'm a Kohen, rise up to bless the congregation, this is how you hold your fingers. And not everybody can do it. You can try it. Not everybody can do it. Pretty good. You're good. You're good. The Rebbe is good. And he said to me, "Remember, you're a Kohen. And that's Jewish aristocracy." I remember I ran into my mother and asked her, "What does aristocracy mean?" That's Jewish aristocracy. Never give up your Jewishness. And this was coming from an ideologue communist. I realized that the definitions are not so simple. And then I was on the train with him, going to his house. He lived in a different part of Brooklyn, Kings Highway. And I was on the train with him. And there were 2 Hasidic Jews, older, with beards and payas and black coat, black hat. And I'm sitting with my grandfather, and we're having some kind of intellectual discussion. I don't remember exactly what, but I realized he wasn't listening to me, and he was paying attention because there were 3 toughs who were playing around with those Hasidim. And my grandfather was absorbed with that, and then the train stopped for the station. And he lunged forward. I remember him as being tall and very strong. And he lunged across, and he grabbed the 3 of them and threw them out of the train. I was scared to death they would come back, kill us. The door closed, but without their coming back. And my grandfather sat down and resumed the conversation like nothing happened. And I said to him, "Why did you do it for those men?" I said, "Grandpa, you're not religious." He said, "What's the difference? They are our family." Never forgot that. Part of the Jewish family, that's something very, very special. All of this taught me what v'ahavta l'reacha really means. And the Torah makes it even more important when the Torah says the most important lesson that we have to take from going out of Egypt, v'ahavtem et hager, gerim hayitem be'eretz Mitzrayim. You have to love the stranger because you were strangers in the land of Egypt. That means you have to love people who are not like you. If I only love people who are like me, then at the end of the day, I may only end up liking myself. I'll tell you something, I may not even like myself because I can change my mind sometimes. Because because I want you to hear me very clearly. V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha for me means that even if I disagree with you, I can still love you, even if I cannot pray with you, because you pray mixed eating and I don't pray mixed eating. I can still love you and I can still learn from you. My grandfather was one of my teachers as well. That's what true pluralism means. It doesn't mean everything goes. You have a right to have your values that you don't want to compromise on. Love doesn't mean you have to give up your values. That's what I believe is Jewish pluralism. And that's why I'm very concerned about the notion that you have to be Orthodox in order to be Jewish. This has tremendous ramifications in terms of the laws of conversion. And I'm only going to say one word. Obviously, when we talk about converting, and conversion is something which is quite common now. To put it mildly, there are 71.2% of Jews, non-Orthodox, and there was 71.2% of 90%. Roughly 10% of the Jews in America are Orthodox Jews. So 71.2% of the 90%, that's the Pew report, are converting. Or intermarrying without converting. But from a Jewish halachic perspective, this is very problematic. And I believe very strongly that you cannot convert anyone unless they at least understand what Judaism is all about. So that means Shabbat, the festivals, kashrut. And they have to be observant to understand. I mean, there's Jewish history, Jewish background, Jewish Catholic Israel, as it's called in the fancy secular literature, but Knesset Yisrael, the Jewish peoplehood, through the generations, has kept all of these things. So I understand that a would-be convert has to study them and begin to practice them. But they don't necessarily have to be Orthodox. Now, that's a very important issue that perhaps requires a whole other lecture, how to do that. I believe it can be done. And I believe I have a formula for doing it. And the correct formula halachically, which does not necessarily take Jews outside of conservative or reform temples. But that's one of the challenges that we really face. And I think we can meet all of these challenges if we understand that we're all one family and we must do everything that we can do in order to bring the Jewish people truly together as one. And I welcome the possibility of a very real relationship between a synagogue in Israel, Zemer Zayit, and a tikva here. I think that it would be a marvelous, marvelous memorial to an individual who was clearly a very, very special rabbi. And I thank you very much for the opportunity of listening to me. I hope that, please God, our relationship will grow in the years to come.